Good afternoon. Thank you for joining United Way's Black History Month event, Untold Stories, part of a Learn United series designed to highlight the narratives of a variety of voices in our community. My name is Jerry Saunders, the CEO of the Afrocentric Personal Development Shop, APDS. Today, we will discuss history and the impact of redlining in Central Ohio. There's two things I want to talk about before we get to the definition there. The first thing is, I just want to really thank United Way for this platform in terms of Black History Month, because typically we will talk about individuals who have contributed greatly to the benefit of Black folks and our communities, all communities. This one here is talking about history in a systemic way as it relates to not only African Americans, but for everyone. And so we're going to talk today about redlining. I know many of us have different definitions for redlining, so I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning when in 1934, the National Housing Act, the National Housing Act was done, and this was under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one president who served more than 2 terms. He's the only president who did that. But it was to withhold mortgage to African American communities so that it would deteriorate those communities and they would not be able to get loans. It was a mortgage move that was made from the federal government now, believe that or not. And then in 1935, they hired the Homeowners Loan Corporation to go through and to put a criteria on all of the communities, the larger communities throughout the United States. And so the criteria was, get this now, they had the 4 levels. They had green, which was that community was desirable to live in. They had blue, which is still desirable to live in. Then there was yellow that said that it was declining, trending downward. And then the color red, that community was hazardous. And at that time, all of the African American communities were classified as hazardous. This was in 1936. And so I have heard the term redlining for years, but I didn't know exactly where it had come from. I got connected with redlining when the sociologist John McKnight introduced it, or coined the phrase, let's say, not introduced it, coined the phrase in 1960 called redlining. And that was the discriminatory practice, whether it was economics, whether it was entertainment, whatever the case may be, housing in particular, in low-income communities. Now, how that has been a tremendous impact on African Americans, it was back then, and then fast forward, let's go up to now where the redlining reduced the value of the home. So a home that was in an area that was considered red would value at, let's say, just to give an example of $100,000. The same type home that would be in an area that was blue might be at 120, and then desirable might be at 140. The importance of that is most of us develop our wealth based on our household income. And so we fast forward from way back then, 1960, let's say 60, not 1934, we'll go from up until now. And recent studies by American Business Survey saying that the household income for African Americans is at $9,000. And for white Americans, it's at $134,000. And a lot of that has to do with the value of your home. So that's from way back to up to now. So we fast forward up to right now. And if we take it on a larger scale, then we talk about devaluing homes in the African American community. And this is data from the American Business Survey, says it's at $156 billion, which is more than what is equated as African American wealth in this country. So it's saying that it's being devalued by $156 billion, which is amazing, because many of us who are business owners who have started businesses usually get a startup from the equity in their home. So that prevented that from occurring all that time. So now I want to, while we know that this started intentionally and officially in 1934 and 1935, they did put the criteria together. 1936 is when the federal government signed off on it, ratified it so that we would have that type of rating going on throughout our country. And we did not really begin to address that until the 60s, and it's still going on now. I also want to say that while it was put in place in 1936, it occurred all before that in terms of African American communities. And the reason this is all important is because we're talking about generational wealth. And your home typically is where you get most of your wealth from. Most folks, unless they own their business and so forth, your home is where you get the wealth, and you pass that wealth on to the next generation. They build on it, pass on to the next generation. Well, I'm going to take you all the way back quickly to 1919, and that was called the Red Summer, because it's critically important, because many people have heard about prosperous cities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood in Florida that were destroyed by white Europeans in the communities next to them because of those communities being so successful. So a lot of us have heard about those two communities. That was 1921, 1923. But if you go back to 1919, it was over 30 cities that occurred to, all during that summer, and they call it the Red Summer. And a quick history on that is that over 380,000 African Americans signed up to fight in World War I to, serve their country, prove that we're here and that we do want to, we are American citizens and do want to do our best to serve our country and to gain some respect. So signed up to fight in the war. And although there were a lot of atrocities and things that went on in terms of racism there, I'm not going to discuss that right now. I do want to discuss that when they returned home is what we want to talk about. They returned home. They had fought in the war gallantly, and they had done really, really well, particularly over in France. And they fought separate from the white counterparts. So they did really well. So those individuals, those soldiers that they were fighting with from the United States, came back and decided that those individuals who served in the war were just too dangerous to be out in the community. So a lot of those soldiers wouldn't wear their uniforms, wouldn't do any of that type stuff, but they still identified those soldiers who fought gallantly, and this is white soldiers, and went to those communities to kill those soldiers who had just fought in the war. Now, I mean, this is hard to believe, but you can look it up, the Red Summer 1919. And they went into those communities, and not only would they go to kill those soldiers, but they destroyed property, the family members, everything else. So those communities were communities where you had some really up and coming individuals who fought in the war, business owners, all of those things, keeping the values of those communities down, and the fact of depressing the opportunity to build wealth generation. So this was even before then, before Tulsa, before Rosewood, that this occurred, and it had continued and fast forward on that. So now I'm talking about the 19, and then I was talking about 1930s and all of that, but I'm going to go back. Let's go to Columbus and talk about Columbus, Ohio. And we'll go back and begin. Most of you probably are aware that it started off as Franklinton in 1797, and that was the community we still have as Franklinton. And the African Americans came north because Ohio was declared a free state, so it wasn't that they had to wait till 1863, 1865 for the 13th Amendment. It was in like 1802 that it was officially here that Ohio was a freedman state, and you couldn't have slaves here in Ohio. So a lot of African Americans moved here. It was in the 1840s when Franklinton was annexed into Columbus, and we were the capital back around 1812, I believe that was. But a lot of African Americans moved to the area and served on it. It was a train that came through. They did service on the train, worked in the industries, the hotels, all those kind of things. And downtown Columbus was booming. And believe it or not, just east of Broad and High Street, a lot of that property there was owned by African Americans. And I read an article by Nimrod Allen, who was the CEO of the Urban League for quite some time, back in 1954, when he talked about how people from downtown, from the 3rd on over to like 9th Street, were African American property owned by African Americans. And then that moved on a little further east. And he talked about all the way over to Woodland Avenue, that Blacks would be in that area. Number of physicians, hotels, pharmacists and all entertainment, all of that was going on in that area. People moved further from downtown as the price of the land went up, and African Americans were moved further from downtown. And that's what was said. I don't know if it was a intentional movement at all, but African Americans took and made that move, moving to the east side back then, and it was very prosperous. Now, when it first started over there, before then, it was the Blackberry Patch. Some of your older folks may remember the Blackberry, that at least your parents talking about the Blackberry Patch, and then Poindexter Village. And you had an outstanding politician back then, Mr. Poindexter, and he had moved there in 1855 and actually was one of the city council people here before Mr. Roseman, John Roseman, came on board. But this was way back then, and they used to call Mr. Poindexter the mayor of Poindexter in that area then. So it was Poindexter Village, then it was Brownsville. Now, to get back to redlining, there was a difference in those areas, like the Blackberry Patch, people just put homes together with whatever kind of material that they did have. And then Poindexter Village was a little more upscale, and then Brownsville was a little more upscale with the more well-structured homes. Redlining considered all three of those communities as red. The red was for hazardous. That's what they had on all three, even though they were a different stock of homes, different income in all the communities, the fact that they were African Americans, they redlined that whole area in terms of being hazardous. Now, Brownsville had it going on, and it was like in the 30s, they were going, all the big time entertainers nationally would come to Columbus, hang out on Mount Vernon, Long Street. One of our royalty family, I call them royalty families, the Beatties, had the Novelty Food Bar over on Long Street. All of the big stars, everybody, Martin Luther King, everybody used to come in town here and hang out. The OJs used to perform on Mount Vernon. All those great things were going on. And then in 61, they began the freeway piece. And the freeway, this is Interstate 71 and I-70, the freeways right now, most major cities that you go to, if you want to know where the Black community is, you can get on the freeway and eventually it will drive right straight through the middle of it. And that is because the federal government intentionally ran the freeways through what we call redline communities, which would be African American communities. So they were ran through those communities and cut, like here, Brownsville off from downtown Columbus. Now, downtown Columbus still had a lot of things going on, the theater, you had the Lazarus folks, the Wolf folks, all these folks were connected. And I don't know exactly where all of them live, but I know it was a close connection to Bexley. So that was a cut that off going there, but they still maintain that relationship. And the folks from Bex still owning property and operating downtown. But for that Bronzeville area, we were like in between Bexley and downtown. And then our main thoroughways were Mount Vernon and Long Street, and those were cut off by the freeway. And it's interesting because I was a kid then. I did not know better. And I just knew that I lived on 541 Grove Street, right there in the community. And I know that I remember us vaguely talking about selling the property, that people were going to buy the house and all that kind of stuff like that. That's what people were talking about in the community. You're going to sell your house because the freeway was coming through there. And lo and behold, they bought the houses all the way up to next door to our house. And so we were at 541 Grove Street. So we were right there, and here was the freeway fence going right straight in front of our house. I was a kid. I did not know any better. A bunch of us children, we were resilient. We made the best of it. We went out. I'm digressing a little bit, but just to show you a perspective from how redlining impacted the community. We went out and slid up and down the hills on the freeway on cardboard boxes. I mean, had a whole lot of fun sliding up and down the hills in the dirt on cardboard boxes. In the wintertime, the exits weren't open. They had the blocks at the end. We'd get up there and slide on sleds all the way down, go hiking out there on the freeway because there weren't any cars on it yet. So I had no idea of that impact that it was having on our community as a kid, because we were enjoying it. And as an adult, I don't think our folks really understood, because we were busy saying we can sell our property and move to another neighborhood, maybe even a better neighborhood. And so I just that was interesting. Now, the challenge was we went to Garfield Elementary School, which we could walk right down the street to the elementary school. When the freeway came through, we had to go the long way now. So it started, now, I didn't recognize it at that time, but it started dividing up our community immediately. And so the friends that I had that I normally could walk right to their homes, I could not do that anymore. The freeway had removed that areas there. And I imagine that this went on in quite a few communities that we had major issues like that. So we'll go back to the redlining on there, but I just reminisce because those were good times. I don't know how much you guys know, but there's Mount Vernon Avenue. We've had pictures of activities going on Mount Vernon Avenue that was just amazing. Elijah Pierce, the artist, he used to, I mean, well, he said artist now, but he was a barber and he used to cut my hair. Him and my dad were very good friends. It was just really great community. And that's what I'm really expressing here, that we had really great community. And I believe that we can get back to that if we really continue to focus on that. But now back to redlining, because it's a serious issue. The redlining was a discriminatory practice, and it was ran on by the banks where they would not invest in our communities. And a lot of that still is occurring right now today. There's been more of a consciousness about it lately with the movement from this past summer with George Floyd and Black Lives Movement. And we've talked about it, but typically it's like a temporary investment, and we need to make those investments in these communities with the people who are living in those communities. Often we have a record of it being gentrified, and while it's okay for people to move in, for all folks to be together, there's not a problem, but I see a challenge when you're taking advantage of people who are already there and they are moved to other areas which are still removing the wealth from their families. And so that's a major issue that I've seen with redlining, because I also lived on Bryden Road, and the property was a lot less when African Americans were over there than now. Now they're about 4 times more. I think that's a conscious decision, a systemic setup that our financial institutions do. I attended Mohawk High School over there next to German Village, and I remember the value of German Village and what German Village was set up for. Initially, when German Village came in, it was considered a ghetto. But over time, the bankers and the people involved, politicians, decided to make that change there. I think those same type of changes can occur in African American communities where there's great stock for the property that's in these communities still on the east side of Columbus that is occurring. So we'll get back to Columbus a little more. When that occurred back in Columbus, that division on the of the highway, that was a major piece for us. But the redlining was on before then and has continued since then. Columbus right now is the 14th largest metropolitan area, and we still have the issue of the value of property in different areas. Even on our south side right now on Parsons Avenue, if you have property that is on the west side of Parsons, it's been valued more than the property going across the street on the east side of Parsons. And there's a difference in the neighborhoods, the names on the neighborhood and all, but the stock and the housing is still similar. And we can do something about this, making a difference in that. I see that someone has indicated on there about the fair housing law has had any impact in Columbus. Well, I know that Lyndon B. Johnson, when they came into, they were doing that and put that in place. I believe that it has had an impact because it did bring some additional funds into the community. But I think the overall impact, the intent of the redlining that was done back in 1934 is still as strong as it was, as effective as it was back then. Just the fact that property in African-American homes and communities rather has been devalued by $156 billion, and that's an estimate, is amazing because that's taken away from the generational wealth. Again, I said earlier about there being the average on the African-American home, $9,000 of household income of wealth in those homes, as opposed to $134,000 in white folks' homes. So it's been effective, even though that came into a place, and I don't know how much of an impact it has had. I can't speak to that, but I would like to think that it was very favorable. I know at the time it was perceived to be very favorable, but when you count the numbers at the end of the day, it does not serve the purpose that the intent that it was set to serve. And that was back in like 1968 that did occur. So that's the interesting things to me. I know we want to save some time for folks to ask some questions, some additional questions. Um, but I want to point out a couple of things here to make sure that we are real clear about the history, because I didn't know that African Americans own so much property downtown. I have been telling people that, as I said earlier, the royalty family, I call them the Beatties, that Otto Beatty Jr. was the first one that owned some property, African American, that owned property downtown Columbus. And then when I did research about it years ago, and I started seeing that African Americans were owning property downtown quite some time ago. So that has been really, really interesting data for me to find out about Bronzeville. And wait a minute, I must say that now I think it started back maybe in early 2000s. They started back looking at renaming it Bronzeville. And then like 2009, I think with Mayor Coleman, they started going on the Bronzeville. We're going to get it back. And that is going on right now. We're doing that right now, which is a positive. It's a much smaller area than what it was before. We had the whole east side there that we were working with. And people just were making things happen. And I think that it's important that we get back to that, where the folks who are serving the community live in our communities. The folks who are making decisions about our communities live in those communities. I just see one of my friends here said that it's now the King Lincoln. We do have the King Lincoln, but I think there's some discrepancy, folks, about that, because some people want to call it Bronzeville still. And so we have that battle going on. But we do know that there's improvement in the real estate, improvement in what's going on. There's resilience in the community. And I'm excited about it. And I know a lot of people are excited about getting that back into the community, of the energy that's there. I've heard about I've experienced it. I was a kid and I wasn't in the clubs or anything, but I experienced seeing all the energy in the community from back then. And I think that it should come back to us as it unfolds now. And so I want to make sure I give time to respond to some questions and so forth on here and on the process there, because we're nearing 12:25 on there. Looking at my notes to make sure anything else interesting that would happen there. Going back, and I'm just quickly try to pull up some things on the Fair Housing Act to see what the benefits were on the Fair Housing Act. So I'm looking at that now to see just how effective that was. There was quite a few marches and everything, Dr. King and that had been going to build up to that, but that came after the Civil Rights Act. But yeah, I don't see so much where that has changed, to be honest. I mean, insurance premiums are still high, mortgage rates are still high in those areas. Folks are, some of the major businesses are reluctant to open businesses in those areas. So that is a concern for me. I know that now we have what we call opportunity zones that's coming from the federal government, which brings some funds in to support areas that have been intentionally redlined over the years. So there are some steps that are being taken to address these issues. But they're coming, and I appreciate them coming, but I just feel like they haven't come fast enough. So it's very important. So for all of us to understand the impact of wealth building that has occurred in this country for years, African Americans have used our energy and resources to help other communities, particularly the white community, to build generational wealth. And it's at a time now where we need to focus and include, I'm not saying just black, but white folks also need to focus on how do we help build generational wealth within our community. I have one question here on the local church leaders doing the help. At this time, um, I'm more of a historian buff. I know that St. Paul, AME, and Bethel on Long Street were two major players when it came to the development in the African American community. I am not familiar at this point what their relationship is in the African American community. I do know that as far as wealth being generated, that a lot of our the funds flow through churches, through religious organizations, and they'll go in on Sunday. Dollars go in on Sunday or whatever day that they're having services, Saturday, maybe even Wednesday, and those dollars are taken to the same financial institutions that have a history of redlining against us. So we collect those dollars, take them to the church. I'm going to take them to the bank, and I would be concerned about the interest rate we would get back when we use those dollars to do building in our community. The issue, one quick red line, I'm trying to leave time for questions, but one quick redlining issue is I do know that several years ago, like 30, 40 years ago, it wasn't advantageous for the banks to do business with the churches. And that was my understanding because I was involved in insurance. But since then, with the mega churches, the churches have gotten involved, finance those situations, those dollars in that church that are collected from the general collections go to those banks. So the banks see advantages and receive advantages from doing business with the churches. I just think that we have to have some type of strategy, and it may be, I'm just one person talking here today, there may be some strategies that our local churches are having in terms of development. My history has been typically the churches are operating separately, and they do development and do great things in the community, housing for the seniors, after school education programs. But what I'm speaking of is holistic, because this redlining is systemic. It's not an individual piece, it's systemic. And I think the best way to address systemic issues is systemically. And so that's the challenge I would put forth to the church, because they do have, and I'm saying religious institutions, they do have a large cash flow that flows through on a consistent basis. So this thing now, if there are any more questions, if folks can give me some more questions on here. I want to make sure that I do the best I can. I got a lot of information, and some of it to me sometimes, I love the information, but sometimes folks, they don't know the purpose. And so I do want to talk one piece about one person, because I saw a person on the line that had introduced me to Lucy Depp. And Lucy Depp, folks, here in Columbus, is a place here in Columbus up in Powell, Ohio. And it used to be like a freedom trail. Like Columbus was a major underground railroad. Remember, I told you earlier in the conversation that the slavery was abandoned up here in 1802 officially, in terms of by the books, while it still did occur. But Lucy Depp Park was up in Powell, Ohio. 300 acres, was owned by a guy named Abraham Depp. He called it the Freedom Station. This is a brother. He came from Virginia. He purchased the land from Joseph Sullivan. I don't know if this is one of the Sullivans with the Franklinton or not, but that he purchased that, and it's still up there. It's about 100 acres now, but you can go up here and check it out. It's got, you can do retreats and things. I know this is COVID time, but there's space, plenty of space there, or even after the COVID period, after we get this resolved, or at least suppress it, that you can go up there to that place. But this was a place that was owned by African Americans, and there was African Road that is right now up on the other side of Westerville. All of that were involved in the Underground Railroad, all along Allen Creek. All those places were there. Someone was, I think, asked for some resources that are on there in terms of being able to help out in the community of what's going on. Somebody says Delaware will have a panel discussion on Lucy Depp Thursday evening. Okay, that's great. But someone asked about resources about history here. One guy who I thought, when I did research before, was really good was a guy named Ed Lentz. And I don't know if Ed writes for the Dispatch, but he does a lot of This Week stories, and he's got some books. Ed Lentz, Lentz, and he did quite a bit of researching on Columbus and how it impacted African and the lifestyle of African Americans here in Columbus. And so it's about that time. So I will look to bring it to a closure. And so I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. We hope this Black History Month event has encouraged you to explore more of the history of Central Ohio and our neighbors. For information about additional programming or how to get involved with Leaders United, the host of this Learn United series, visit liveunitedcentralohio.org/Leaders United. Again, I want to thank United Way for having me here this day. I really enjoyed sharing information. I really enjoy hearing, and I love learning. So if anyone has any information they'd like to send to me, that would be great. I love learning, so please do. And I thank you very much. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.